sandwiched between two famous kings, his father John and his son Edward. He is the forgotten ruler of the 13th century. His reign was long and not beaten until George III. So, follow me as we explore the tumultuous reign of Henry III. Let's get stuck in. It starts with a love triangle and a betrothal. Two men had fallen in love with the young and beautiful Isabella of Angoulême. One of these men was the dashing Hugh de Lusignan, a French nobleman who Isabella was already set to marry. The other was the controversial and tyrannical ruler of England, the now infamous King John, the son of the almost mythical power couple Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. The year was 1200. But King John got his way and the two were married. No, not Hugh and John, John and Isabella. And the king was apparently addicted to her bedchamber. He lusted over her more than any other woman, and he had plenty of other women. Though, this would not be a happy ever after. We don't know her true thoughts on the king, but let's just say that once King John died, she would never mention him ever again, and marry Hugh de Lusignan. Silence is louder than words. And it would become a love triangle that would cause a rift between the already antagonistic kingdoms of England and France. You see, the French king, Philip Augustus, coveted the continental lands held by the Angevin Empire. Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine had built a vast empire that reduced France to a small region around Paris. But by now it was falling apart. Richard the Lionheart had warred with King Philip over said lands and died in the process. John had tried to stop the French war machine to no avail, losing Normandy in the process, much to everyone's frustration, apart from the French. And the Angoulême lands could have been acquired by the French, instead got snapped up by the English in a highly controversial move by King John. Oh, and did I mention that Isabella was to be John's second wife? He'd only just had his marriage annulled to another Isabella, and the two Isabellas would even live together for a short time. Just another twist in an already festering wound between the two kingdoms. During this time, John had no children, and the only heir to the English throne being the newly knighted Arthur of Brittany. Only in his mid-teens, Arthur was loyal to France. And soon all the politics had reached boiling point and conflict broke out, a conflict which resulted in the alleged murder of Arthur at the hands of King John. Enough was enough, and war erupted between the two kingdoms. Philip Augustus of France took the Angevin lands on the continent swiftly and without error. John and Isabella's lands fell to the French. Add to this rising tensions between King John and the papacy. All the while, King John tried to wrest his continental lands back to no avail, and there was still no legitimate heir to the English throne. This is the current year, 1207. This is the tumultuous world the young Henry would soon be born into, on a cold October the 1st, at Winchester Castle. So little is recorded about the toddling years of young Henry. What we do know is that he was raised by a wet nurse called Eleanor, and he was only a few months old when his father John would suffer the full brunt of the Pope's wrath, which would result not only in a religious interdict barring the church from everyone. Most sacraments were banned, and the excommunication of the English king only made things worse. And in 1209, just a couple of years later, his father had made a deal with the elderly William the Lion of Scotland. A deal that saw the 2-year-old boy betrothed to the Scottish king's daughter, Margret, a young woman of 16 years. Imagine that. A young teenager married a 2-year-old toddler. Oh, and if that failed, say Henry died in infancy, then John had a backup plan. The 7-month-old Richard, Henry's brother. And it's not like William of Scots had much of a choice. His only son, Alexander, was a hostage to John, a political prisoner, grown up in the royal household. This was because the Scottish king fought against Henry II, and a treaty in 1174 dictated that the Scottish king obeyed this. And in 1209, Margret, along with her sister Isabella, was also held as hostage at Corfe Castle. More hostages for John. He loved his hostages, and was more than willing to hang them if the parents didn't play ball, as the Welsh would soon find out. Thankfully for poor Margret, this marriage proposal eventually falls through. William is old and ill, and his son, Alexander II, escapes John's clutches and becomes the future King of Scotland. All deals are off. Little Henry grew up in an age with very little religious sacraments, highly unusual for the era, and due to his father's actions plunging the kingdom into interdict. Henry wouldn't have seen Mass, except in certain circumstances, when it was allowed. Obviously, there had been priests teaching him scripture, but this was a world without sacraments. Effectively, the church was on strike. He wouldn't have seen the splendour of things like Christmas and Easter, the weddings or the Eucharist, which no doubt explains why he became so dedicated to the church during his reign. His mother, Isabella of Angoulême, likely kept somewhat close to her children, unlike John, who kept him away from court, shielding his family from the breaking tensions. How much Henry knew or understood about the growing tensions in the kingdom is anyone's guess, but he was most likely shielded. As we know, there was a lot of conflict in the kingdom, and it's only going to get worse, as John was determined to unite the whole of Scotland, Ireland and Wales against him. And when a plot to assassinate the king is uncovered, John retreats and recluses for a short while. And while this is going on, the rumour mill goes wild. And in 1212, Isabella of Angoulême is said to have been raped and her boys murdered at Marlborough Castle. All lies, but it gives you an idea of the world Henry was growing up in. This was also the year that the 5-year-old boy was entrusted to Peter de Roche, the Bishop of Winchester, relatively new to the position, a man loyal to the last in his support of King John, and who also ran the roaming exchequer. Soon he'll become the Chief Justiciar of England, for a brief few years. Now he was also the boy's custodian. Young Henry began his training in the military arts, taught by Philip de Aubigny, a northern knight with connections to Brittany. Another chap, Ralph of St. Sampson, taught him horsemanship, so we know that unlike his father, Prince Henry was certainly being prepped for being king, complete with all the military training he needed. Especially with the kingdom poised for a possible invasion from France. And around this time, the controversial King of England has made peace with the Pope through the papal legate Pandulf. I can just imagine what the young prince thought of this. And the church having power over kings. Little things like this make impressions on a child. It's easy to forget while reading up on history just how much of an impact this interdict had on people. The ultimate collective punishment, barring an entire country from the church, and it was effective. But now all that was lifted, much to the joy of all. And you can just imagine what a 6-year-old boy made of the splendour. That was the 13th century Catholic Church. Political bias aside, this must have grabbed his attention, as this is the king who shunned tournaments and admired religious architecture and splendour, the builder of cathedrals. But I'm getting ahead of myself. He's only 6. He'll see his first real Christmas. Obviously he had Christmas, all the feasts and all the trimmings, but not from a religious perspective. Not the watered-down secular version, devoid of sacraments, but the full pomp and circumstance. He'll see Easter, complete with the ceremony of lights. Mass was now the norm. Weddings, you name it. Now the fasts and feasts had a greater meaning, especially in a time of constant conflict. His father ends up allying with the Holy Roman Empire and Flanders in a bid to topple the French king, only culminating in a crushing defeat at the Battle of Boulogne. The lost lands on the continent had truly fallen, and neither John nor Henry would ever get them back. And of course, there is the event that would have the greatest impact on Henry's life: Magna Carta, a document initially meant as a peace treaty with King John, but also to pave the way for reform and change. The barons were reining in the king. Absolute rule would come to an end. And Philip the Albany, the chap who was teaching Henry the arts of being a knight, was one of the men who served at the king's side when the Great Charter was signed. He's name-dropped in the document itself. But the rebels got the Pope to consider it null and void, and when the inevitable war broke out with the barons, the Albany controls the forces in the south, around Kent, where most of the action was. He's on the king's side, loyal to the last. During all of this, Henry, his brothers and sisters, were moved around the place to protect them from the turmoil that was breaking out all over the kingdom. Baron fought baron, brother fought brother in this horrid civil war. Entire towns were put to the torch. Battles erupted all the way from Scotland to Kent. To make matters worse, the rebel barons, led by Robert Fitzwater and his Holy Army of God, had invited the French heir, Louis the Lion, over to take his place as the future King of England. The Plantagenet line had come to an end. At least King John had thought, anyway. He'd lost the crown, literally, not figuratively. He'd lost them in the waters of the Wash, and there was no hope in sight that Henry nor Richard would ever see the throne. The French controlled London, the capital. They controlled Winchester, most of the country. All that held up was Dover and Lincoln, as the rest of the kingdom fell to the rebels. At some time, the now 9-year-old boy Henry was at Corfe Castle, being kept out of the war, shielded by his mother, Isabella of Angoulême. But at this point in the war, John was actually doing quite well. He'd beaten most of the rebels, which were mostly holed up in London by now. He's doing a tour of the north. And the French were in a quagmire at Dover, which was refusing to quit, and Lincoln Castle was as stubborn as ever. If it wasn't for John's tragic and sudden death due to illness, maybe he could have wrested the kingdom. Alas, it wasn't so. And in his will, John secures the children's inheritance, but didn't see the kingdom truly passing to them. It was over. He was in God's hands now, and the rest of his will is merely patting his supporters on the back with financial payoffs and making sure his eternal soul is safe from Satan's pokey sticks. The dead king was buried in Worcester, having lost the continental lands. Therefore not buried with his mother, father and brother. London was out of the question, as the French held the city, and there was a backup. A monastery that he had built to apologise for his attempted pogrom on the Cistercians, but that was right out It was in the hands of the rebels. So Gloucester it was. Now, the barons had a bit of a dilemma on their hands. The royal supporters obviously supported the 9-year-old Henry, there was no doubt about that. He was the son of John, but the rebels, like Fitzwalter and all those chaps, they'd invited the French over and they were suffering from buyer's remorse. There were several factors in this, like the French wanting to replace the barons with French counts. Oh, I didn't say anything, you lot. Counts! Those counts didn't have England's interest at heart. Add to this, Henry was not John. He was a boy that could be moulded, shaped. The rebels would effectively run the kingdom like they planned to in the first place. A lot of rebels saw logic on this. They pretty much switched their allegiance overnight to Henry. From Corfe Castle, Isabella of Angoulême at some point heard the news her husband, the King of England, was dead. Apparently dysentery, at least according to Ralph Coggeshal. Her concerns are not recorded, but she must have feared the worst. She wouldn't have been privy to the change of heart by the barons. As far as she's concerned, enemies were on every side, and even William Longsby, the half-brother of the king, had joined the rebels. The Kingdom of England belonged to France. Unfortunately, even though some of the rebels were now backing the young boy, Louis, Dauphin of France, was enhancing his already sizable army with reinforcements from France. England looked truly doomed. In the north, Eustace de Vesey had allied with Alexander II of Scotland, and before long, the 3 northern counties had surrendered. The north belonged to Eustace de Vesey, while in the south, Robert Fitzwalter and Louis the Lion of France, the Dauphin, ruled every inch from Winchester to Kent, and knocked over them. They still held out. Hubert de Burgh, the Castellan, had once held Chateau Gaillard. He knew how to hold out in a siege, as did Lincoln up north, where the old widow, Nicola de la Haye, still controlled her lands. But even the Welsh, led by Llywelyn the Great, were still supporting Louis of France. So the switching of a few rebels to the royal side wasn't a ticket to victory. Henry was the heir to a fallen kingdom, and as far as everyone was concerned, Louis was the new king. And once he defeated the English royals, he would have his coronation. To be blunt, the royalists were buggered. But there was hope. Peter de Roche, Bishop of Winchester, was no stranger to battle. He protected the boy. And there was Ranulph de Blondeville, Earl of Chester. He was loyal. And then there was William Marshall, the legend himself. No, not that legend. The legendary knight, the Earl of Pembroke. Although an old man knocking 70, he had seen several kings. A seasoned warrior, loyal to the throne. Probably the most powerful man in the kingdom. This little coterie needed not just a handful of the rebels, but the majority. They needed convincing. But if the rebels wouldn't follow a prince, would they follow a king? Henry had to be crowned. They'd crown this boy. It would be the dawn of a new era. All the troubles caused by John could be washed away. Peace could be achieved, and they could reissue the Magna Carta, tailor it for Henry, and he would sign it willingly. And the Pope would have to accept it, as it was not extorted by force. Traditionally, the Archbishop of Canterbury crowned a king, but to everyone's dismay, Stephen Langton was still held in Rome. He'd failed to excommunicate the rebel barons, so was currently explaining his actions to Pope Honorius III. The highest representative was Gualabiceri, the cardinal from Rome sent to stop the French invasion. Dressed in red robes and riding atop a white horse, he effectively turned the First Barons' War into a crusade against the excommunicated French Dauphin. But there was still one problem. Where would they crown the new king? Louis still held London and Winchester. They decided on Gloucester. Swiftly, they put their plan into action. News was sent to Corfe Castle, to Queen Isabella of Angoulême. Her entourage was to head to Devizes, from there to Gloucester. Under the command of Peter de Roche and aided by Ralph de St. Sampson, Queen Isabella and her children made their fateful journey to Devizes Castle. While from Worcester, John's executors of the will raced to Gloucester to prepare the coronation. To say this was a rushed ceremony would be an understatement. At Devizes, the no doubt nervous Isabella met with Thomas de Stamford. She probably feared the worst as they made their way to Gloucester. And on their journey, on a plain in Malmesbury, stood a small army. Their hearts must have sunk. But it was the Marshal, leading a royal force. There they met, Marshal's knights, all dressed for war, neither knowing what to expect. But he wasn't dressed for war against Henry, no. Sir Ralph de Sampson takes the young prince and presents him to William Marshal. The young boy, only 9, was told to say one thing, that he entrusted himself to Earl and to God. Ralph was no longer in charge of the boy, the Marshal was, and grasping the boy's hand, he swore an oath of fealty. That was it. The boy burst into tears. It was too much for him. Then tears were shed by all. But the tension had been broken. It broke the hardest of hearts. This wasn't John, whose mood could change at the drop of a hat. This was a humble boy. This was the dawn of a new era. A boy of 9 and an old retired knight of 70? This sounds like the plotline of a fantasy movie from the 80s. Alas, this was the reality. This was England's future. Provided they could win back the kingdom, there was still work to do. So they were in Gloucester, held secure by royal supporters. A short-lived argument erupted. They couldn't have the coronation without Ranulph de Blondeville, who wasn't currently here, a veteran and legend just like the Marshal, but time was of the essence, so they decided to have the ceremony anyway. And at St. Peter's Abbey, Gloucester Cathedral, on the 28th of October, 1216, which was the vigil of Simon and Jude, the coronation began. Peter de Roches was the highest ranking bishop, and he conducted the coronation, no doubt aided by Gualabiceri, the cardinal. Imagine it, you're 9 years old, your father just died, you don't know the fate of the kingdom, everything's in turmoil, and you're led up through these areas, just with a handful of people. The Bishop of Bath, Jocelyn of Wells, administered the royal oath, the new king reciting after him. Young Henry announced in a high voice that he would maintain peace, honour, reverence to God. He'd do justice to his people, observe good laws and customs, and abolish all the bad and evil ones. Henry then, copying Jocelyn's script, took it further. And he did homage to the papacy for England and Ireland, swearing to pay the Irish the 700 marks in tribute that John promised them, along with the 1,000 marks tithe to Rome.
and here he was crowned. Now, because John had lost the crown, in the wash, literally, not figuratively, his mother's tiara had to be used. Just think of that. A very, very small, humble boy, led up there to become the King of England.
He was anointed. Robes had been made to his size, and everywhere there were tears, not of sorrow, despite the bleakness of the kingdom's future, but tears of joy, the innocent boy of destiny. To top all this, William Marshal understood that no baron would follow a king who had not been knighted, so took it upon himself to formally knight the young Henry. And thus, this young child was crowned Henry III of England.
For those who might recognise these halls, this is where part of Harry Potter was filmed. I just thought a little mention this a little bit. Chamber series.
By the way, guys, there's
You're a heretic, Harry.
Oh, it must have peeved the French. England was in their grasp. Now, the controversial Louis, nothing but a usurper, a pretender. He'd been pipped to the post. And Henry, now king, was carried on people's shoulders to his chamber at the nearby castle, robes now replaced by less formal ones, as the great feast commenced. And the people in this era knew how to feast. The next day, Ranulph de Blondeville arrives with his retinue, totally supporting the coronation. And nobles were flocking to the royal cause. Bugger the French. They rallied behind this English king. The Marcher lords were here, including the fallen de Broasses, the Mortimers, the Cliffords, the Lasses. The south may have fallen, the north may have fallen, but the Midlands and the Marcher lords were staunchly loyal. And Henry also had support from Rome, the Pope himself. There was a problem though. Henry didn't have much of a kingdom. He relied on the taxes, and most of the revenue was being taken by the French and the rebels. He was a very poor king. And who would protect him? Ranulph de Blondeville suggests the Marshal, who'd already been suggested as protector, but old William protested. "I am an old man, and this child has no money." Why not his mentor, Peter de Roches? Maybe even teach the king some of the baldy songs he was fond of. Other nobles reminded William of the prestige, but the old knight still refused. At last, Gualabicieri stepped forward. He declared he would carry this young king on his shoulders across Europe begging for bread if need be. But there was a war to win, and he required someone else to carry the burden. The cardinal had spoken, and the Marshal saw reason. He'd become the protector of the king. Isabella wasn't even considered, which probably explains her actions the next year. She abandons her children. She abandons the kingdom. She flees to France and marries her true love, Guy de Lusignan. And she would never mention John again. Unfortunately, during the joy and festivities, William Marshal learned that his castle at Goodrich was besieged by the Welsh. The legendary knight acted swiftly. He dispatched an army of knights, sergeants and crossbowmen to break the leaguer, which they did with ease. This was the turning of the tide.